Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Hall, Executive Director, Montclair Film. Thank you so much for joining us today for our screening of You Asked for the Facts. Please welcome the director, Mary Blessey. Hi, Mary.
Hey, Tom. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you. Thanks for sharing the film with us. I want to start talking about the film by asking you about sort of the decision to make this film and tell this story. What was it about Bobby Kennedy going to the University of Mississippi, sort of returning in 1966, that drew you to tell the story today? It's not sort of my generation's story. It's not your generation's story. What drew you personally as an artist to this story?
Well, there are so many parallels to our present moment in the film. And that was striking to me even back in 2017 when I actually started on the project. So this has been a kind of long and winding road, as documentary projects like this, especially archival based, tend to be. Finished up a version of the film late 2019. I've since added a little bit to it, but I say that because, of course, as you know, with your festival being postponed, everything has been delayed because of the pandemic. And I say that because when I watch the film now, and some of those interviews are as early as 2017, many are 2018, a few are 2019. And this film was set to come out, like early this year. And so much has changed. The context, watching it now that's actually really interesting for me as a filmmaker to observe that. Because in some ways it has only gotten increasingly timely, the subject matter of demagoguery and misinformation and, behind the scenes, lying to the public, all those themes that I guess we might get into. So you're asking what drew me to it, even in 2017, of course, and speaking to all the people we interviewed in the film and their commentary, it was just striking to see, the past and the present, I guess I would say.
And, I think everyone knows the story of, or should know the story of James Meredith and the integration of the University of Mississippi, but I don't know that a lot of people know or knew about this moment in particular, in this sort of revelatory moment on campus years later, where there was a sort of a truth and reconciliation happening with Bobby Kennedy returning. How did you discover this story? It seems like sort of almost like a footnote in history, but to discover one that's so relevant, like you said, to today's time seems like a real gift. How did you find out about the story?
Well, my father is interviewed in the film. You may have noticed our last names. So he was a law student at the University of Mississippi in '66, and he was one of the students that co-organized the plan to bring Kennedy to get around the speaker ban. So I had actually heard about this story a little bit, was familiar with it from my parents talking about it. And then I actually, in graduate school at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, I had done an oral history project interviewing one of the law students, Frank Thaxton, who was the law student they planted in the audience, worked with Kennedy to have this plan to have a law student in the audience who was going to ask this specific question Kennedy wanted to be asked. So I did an oral history project with him. So I had known about this story, and basically I'll say I'd known about this story, and every time I would talk about this story with other people, they would be like, there needs to be something about this. Like, how did more people not know about this? So I knew it was something that would be really interesting, and a lot of people, as you said, who are of course familiar with James Meredith in '62, would be really interested to hear this kind of follow-up story. I don't even want to say follow-up story, they're just different stories, but to hear about Bobby Kennedy coming to Mississippi in '66, in the climate of '66, with all the controversy and genuine fear for his safety surrounding his visit. So I knew about it. We interviewed my father in the film and his other classmates who kind of schemed to bring Kennedy. So that's how I knew about it. But I knew wider audiences would be interested in this.
And there's, one of the interesting things that I did not know about that I learned from the film is the idea of a college campus having a speaker ban, which we're seeing sort of the inverse of today. A lot of, I think, conservatives are concerned about colleges not inviting conservative speakers. But the free speech movement on college campuses was really a galvanizing force in the anti-war movement and political activation of young people in the 1960s. And I'm wondering how you might have addressed that issue when you were editing the film together and putting that story together, because it seems to be sort of the fundamental moment that allows the truth to come out, and that they are able to pull this speech off and sort of circumvent the ban. And this is sort of, I thought was one of the bigger reveals of the film. Can you talk about sort of narratively how that fit for you, setting that up and putting that in the movie?
Setting up the speaker ban.
Yeah, so I thought that was sort of the driver, the engine that drove the film in a lot of ways.
Yes. Well, first of all, it becomes very clear when you study certainly this chapter in Mississippi history and start reading into the speaker ban, that it was absolutely put in place to try to prevent the very type of thing that, in this particular case, but many other speakers as well, Bobby Kennedy was coming to voice, which is essentially the speaker ban was to keep out outside agitators, AKA anyone who would say anything pro-civil rights, right, or against the segregationist, white supremacist establishment in Mississippi. So they very much wanted it to serve that purpose. And it was later overturned by a federal court in a lawsuit deemed as unconstitutional. That was a few years after this. But that is so you're asking about how to frame it in the film. What's interesting to me about the speaker ban and the relationship to the press in Mississippi at the time is that the press was also so in the back pocket of Ross Barnett, and by 66, Ross Barnett was no longer governor at the time, but the establishment certainly still in place, general segregationist establishment in Mississippi. And again, side note, if you've watched the film, you may have seen this, but in Mississippi at that time, governors couldn't serve consecutively, but you could run again. So Ross Barnett had to step out for 4 years, and he was going to run again in 67. Anyway, the press was so just spouting propaganda, the Clarion Ledger, the Hederman Press in Jackson, that there wasn't, you hear the students talk about this in the film, there wasn't really a way to get this story out. Of course, you didn't have the internet, obviously. You don't have, and that's its own whole conversation, but you don't have outlets, right? So it's like, how do you even, if you have this inside tip about this thing, and there's recording, so there's evidence, there's documentation, there's literally a recording, and those have since, of course, been released, and you can hear them in the film, and they're, you can find them at the Kennedy Library and everything. But how do you get this out if the press isn't going to report it? You almost had to create something that the press couldn't not report. That was their strategy, is if someone as famous as Bobby Kennedy, because he's a national figure, comes down and he says this in a room with 6,000 people live, well, then you at least have 6,000 people who are witnesses to the fact that he said it. Now, just because he said it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. In this case, it is true. But it is at least true that he said it. So now the conversation is happening, and they did eventually release the tape. So now you've got it on tape. And so, all of that unfolded, and it was just obvious that Ross Barnett had been caught red-handed. But that's why you needed to get around the speaker ban that was put in place, because they didn't want people to come expose something just exactly like this.
Yeah, and I thought one of the things that I thought, maybe not a parallel to today, but something that sort of moved me profoundly about the movie is, of course, the reaction of the audience after the, I would say, speech, and the overwhelming response that Kennedy got in Mississippi, which was very unexpected to me, given sort of the polarization that we see today. Did that provide, as a filmmaker for you, as a person, a citizen, does that provide you with hope, or thought that maybe we can overcome? You mentioned not having an internet now, or not having an internet then, we have it now. Misinformation now seems much more powerful. How did that work, in terms of your own thinking or your own emotional reaction to the result of the speech?
part of me wants to say, I don't know if misinformation is more powerful now or if it's just in the current vessel of the time that we live in, and it's been a problem for all of history of humanity. And technology has, evolved, so the method with which disinformation spreads maybe has evolved, or maybe it is more powerful because of like a sea change in the technology. I don't know. That's someone smarter than me can figure out the answer to that question. But well, first of all, so earlier, let's think. My reaction to seeing the way the crowd reacted in '66, watching it, and this is even it's only increased now in 2020, but even a few years ago, or even hearing about this story years and years ago, as a person growing up in Mississippi, I can't help but be struck by, yes, this is a cool story, and this is like a glimmer of hope you're definitely seeing in this audience, but we know the political establishment didn't change that much. We still deal with all these same problems today and have even receded, backslided, if that was possible. And it's complicated because you see how much has not changed, but also you want to talk about the good. So it's a complicated mix, and this is quoted in the film, and this is often quoted in discussions about all of this today. You have better angels, right? You have the dark side, you have better angels. They are constantly in conflict with one another. It requires constant revisiting of history, constant revising, constant work, constant maintenance. It's not like you're ever done. And I think people get comfortable when they reach certain milestones and think they're done and think they can't backslide. And I think we're in a moment now where everyone realizes clearly that's not the case. So I guess I think when I look at that footage, that audience, I'm just thinking about both sides. On the one hand, it's hopeful, because if this many white Mississippians in 1966, which that crowd is majority white in that audience, can at least be in the climate of the day, if you understand the history, that they are responding and they want to be told the truth. They are a product of this environment that they're in. And I don't say that in any sort of excusing way. I'm saying, looking at how they exist, they are receptive to realizing that they've been lied to, and they at minimum they don't like that. So there's a respect, at least in that audience, and this wouldn't be everyone everywhere, but just taking isolated that audience in that Coliseum, there's 6,000 people, the overwhelming reaction was that Bobby Kennedy was speaking to them he was holding no punches and not sugarcoating anything, but he was speaking to them like extending an olive branch, like speaking to them like adults and with respect, and just saying, here's what happened. And they were being receptive to that. Clearly it didn't change everyone's mind, though. It's not as if one event like this can just change everyone's mind, but it is an interesting window into, I guess, the possibility for change if, in an event where something's revealed, these people are being receptive to it. There were a lot of people who did want to change. And I guess I should say that to my remarks earlier, is that Mississippi has come a long way, obviously very far to go, just like the whole country has come a long way and obviously very far to go. So there have been huge strides. I think there were people in that generation in the 60s who did not want to be their parents. And those people were in Mississippi just like they were anywhere else. And you see a moment of them being receptive to that and appreciating being told the truth. And that's an interesting window into that moment, but it's very complex.
Totally. So one of the things I always like to discuss with nonfiction filmmakers, of course, is that there's a sort of responsibility to the facts. You name the movie, you ask for the facts. But there's also an editorial point of view that you have as an artist and a filmmaker. Here you're working with archival footage and you're living in contemporary times and you're seeing these parallels as an artist and a filmmaker. Can you talk about working with the archive a little bit and the choices that you made and how you accessed it? Where did you find all this footage? How did you end up putting it together? It does tell a pretty linear story, but I'm sure there are choices that you had to make about how that story gets told, where you insert contemporary interviews to highlight points and sort of underscore themes. And that's always, I think, one of the great skills with a great documentary is sort of finding that balance between the contemporary and the archival. Can you talk a little bit about working with the archive and creating a story from, what you had available?
Yes. Well, so we found basically what made this film happen and what made it possible was finding this treasure trove of footage from NBC News that shows the Q&A portion of the event. And so that's the portion of the event where Bobby Kennedy has planted a student in the audience to ask him a question about Ross Barnett, which he wanted to do because if he just started talking about it on his own, he was worried about the appearance of that and it would look like, oh, he just came down here just to talk about that. So there was a little bit of like a finesse and political theater to that of trying to make it seem like, oh, well, if you really insist, I'll answer the question. That has not been seen before on tape, this main speech. So he gives a main speech, everybody claps, and then they start the Q&A. The main speech, at least the audio recording, has been, available through the university since the time. You can Google it and listen to his entire main speech from the university library. And his main speech is an important speech where he's speaking to civil rights and the issues of the time in Oxford, Mississippi in 1966 in that climate. So even that was, it may be hard to appreciate now, the climate of what he was doing there, speaking to that audience of 6,000 people in Oxford, Mississippi. But so finding the archives of the Q&A where we actually see him answer this question and we see him dodge it. I mean, one of the things that was important, you're asking about the interaction between the current interviews and the archival. The archival footage of Bobby Kennedy in this Q&A confirms what these students are saying they plan. I mean, you hear Frank Thaxton talking about how he was told beforehand, you're gonna have to ask it more than once, kind of seem like you're pushing him so he can kind of finally relent and answer the question. And then you see him do that in the video. He does have to ask it more than once. And he's like, do you want to ask me another question about that? Bobby Kennedy says, do you want to ask me another question? So that's, I try to think about how to weave that together. And, but it was limited by what we had available for sure. That's always the problem with documentary, but especially archival from a time period like this. I mean, I used pretty much all the footage they had of the Q&A. And at that time, news camera people would turn the camera off to save film. And there's a few key moments where they turn the camera off and I'm just like, why did you turn it off right there? But luckily we got the main stuff. We had very limited footage for even stuff like crowd shots. I mean, I milked those for all they were worth. Like they slowed them down, showed it from another angle. I mean, it was like desperate. I don't know if you wanted this type of in the weeds of an answer, but it was in the editing room. It was like, this is what we have. You can't, it's a historical documentary. I mean, of course there are other creative techniques and people sometimes do animation or they, cut to something else or whatever, but I really wanted to stay in that room and I really wanted it to be the real footage of that real room as it was happening. So the cuts were limited to what was available, but I also deliberately decided to let Bobby Kennedy's answers as much as I possibly could due to the constraints of where the cameramen had actually cut off their cameras. I just wanted to let it run. which is not, you don't always want to do. Certainly earlier in the film, there's no one talking for that long at one time. Usually you want to be careful about that. But that's what I wanted. And some people I don't know if that style, to some people it may be, it depends on how interested in the topic you are. If you're interested in the topic, it's not boring. Some people may think it's boring to let it run. I wanted, by the time we get there in the film, you've heard all the backstory, you've been watching for like 30 minutes now. Once we get in that room, I want to be in that room. And I want to just hear what he had to say instead of chopping it up into sound bites and we don't get the context and we don't understand. And that's such a problem in our current world, right? And I was like, no, just play it. Let's hear him. At one point he talks for like 5 minutes straight and I don't cut it. So that was a deliberate decision.
Well, I was very interested in the whole time. So I have a couple more questions. One that I think is important to talk about is your contemporary interview gets. So F. Kennedy obviously is a big get. You have a lot of the key players from the time period talking to you on camera. How reluctant or excited were they to participate? And what was the process of tracking them down and interviewing them for you?
If anyone was reluctant to participate, they didn't tell me. They were all very kind. No, I'm saying that in jest. Everybody was very excited about getting this story told. Mrs. Kennedy, you hear her remarks in the film. She was wonderful to talk to, and she really, obviously she went to uncountable events and speeches and met people and shook hands with everybody, right? So she's got a ton of memories of doing this for years and years and years. And she really remembers this event, or this is the impression that I got, because of the climate surrounding it. There was so much controversy about this event, of course, with what had happened with the James Meredith enrollment 4 years before. And there were death threats being sent to the school. There was, top security at this event. The Kennedys actually, or Kennedy sent down, an advance team to check on the safety, I guess, as they would in general, but I mean, certainly in this situation. So it was definitely a tense environment that she walked into, that they walked into. She says in the film, I don't even know if I should reveal it. Go watch the film if you haven't watched the film, if you're watching this panel. But she explains in the film what she was so nervous about. Or she explains in her words what she was thinking when she walked on the stage, being really nervous to be there. So I think she was really excited to share her memory of that because it was so striking, the warm reception that they got, that they were so welcomed, and he got multiple standing ovations. It was not just polite applause, and that's what everyone I talked to in interviews said, that it could have been even, just totally bare minimum, just clap once and okay, like that could have been the event. But there were multiple standing ovations during this, and the crowd was laughing, and you see headlines talking about Kennedy, and these are from Southern papers and stuff, admitting like Kennedy has charmed the Southern audience and stuff. So it was such an unexpectedly warm event that I think it's, in her interview, certainly she conveys that she was struck by, and I think that's why she remembers it.
And then last question for you. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, sort of the impact that the pandemic has had on the life of the movie. But what is next for the film? We're grateful that you're showing it at our festival, and I know it's played others. What's next for the film, and what's next for you as a filmmaker?
Well, for the film, I mean, right now, like you said, the pandemic has changed everything. It's screening at several virtual festivals and having some university events. One of the things that was really exciting before the pandemic that we had lined up is that a number of law schools or other legal oriented, groups and associations were interested in screening it or holding a discussion because it's so relevant to law school and law students in the legal profession, because this was organized by the Law School Speakers Bureau. Robert Kennedy, former Attorney General, is coming down to talk about enforcing this court order. And he gets into this whole discussion. And that's what I was saying earlier about just letting the tape run and wanting to hear what he has to say. He's really addressing law students in particular. So that was kind of an exciting opportunity for more like academic discussion. And that was one of the things I really hope to still do, of course, with this film. I think it's really ripe for academic discussion in a university setting, because that's on a sort of meta level. That is what's happening in the film, right? So students digging into something, digging into the history, talking about it, sharing their opinions. I would love to see a panel of current law students who are my generation and younger talking about what they think about this story. So and there will be ways to have that kind of stuff play out, hopefully, in the pandemic. We're all adjusting to this, but I'm glad that, the good side of everything going virtual is it's probably allowing more people to watch it, so they can tune in online who wouldn't have been able to go in person. So I'm just excited for this story to get out there.
We're so grateful to you for bringing it to the festival. Thank you so much, and best wishes on the future with the film and your next project.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.